Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is having a good day or had a good day or hopefully will have a good day. My name is Ankita Kulkarni. I'm a tech lead at Loblaw Digital, and today I'm going to be talking about, oh, hello, Apollo Client and Farewell Redux. Like I said, I'm Ankita. I'm working on at Loblaw Digital on a e-commerce application like called Shoppers Drug Mart. And today I'm going to be taking you on a journey for why I guess it's time for us to say maybe farewell to Redux and why Apollo Client is should be used essentially for as a good state management strategy. So let's take a step back here and assess what we usually typically look for in a good state management library, or what exactly do we mean by good state management? What makes a good state manager? So there are a few principles, one being that the data is normalized. So if you think about it, you don't want the data to be duplicated in your global store overall just because you don't know what the source of truth is, what the real thing is, and it makes sense. Data gets transformed pretty consistently. So, for example, you want to make sure that the transformation of data is quite consistent so that whenever you pass your input, that's exactly what you pass and get in as an output. You're able to visualize the global state. Visualization helps, right? So when you are able to visualize the global state, it makes sense because then you can kind of debug what's going on and whatnot, which brings up me to my next topic, which is debugging is not hard. Is debugging ever that easy? It could be at times, but just to make sure that whenever something is going wrong with our state, we are able to debug it quite easily. And lastly, you can write tests. So this is extremely important just because whatever code you're writing is extremely important to be able to write tests for that as well. And we all know a library that was good at this or is still good at this, I guess. Redux fixes everything. I have used Redux a lot in a lot of different applications, and it is quite remarkable and how we can use Redux to essentially do complete front end management of your overall state. But as most libraries, Redux is also opinionated in terms of how things go. What exact For those who don't know, I want to talk about like what exactly is Redux, right? Redux is essentially a predictable state container for JavaScript. In other words, it's meant to handle and organize global application state data. So as you can see, you don't need to dispatch an action, which goes into the dispatcher, and we need a reducer to manipulate the state so that a UI component gets rendered. And in a Redux world, or I would say in any sort of like async action itself, there are different action types. One being, for example, a cart request would typically have a success and an error as well. So it's extremely important that cart request is handled correctly, and we do get necessary success and error data based on that. And based on that, we would be able to show the different loading states as well. So essentially, this is what asynchronous request would look like in a Redux application. This is a Redux Saga example. And as you can notice that you're able to fetch the card data. So get card query is something that is defined for the card query itself. And you can dispatch an action like card success. And then if there's an error, you dispatch card error. And at the bottom here, we also have like a watcher, which essentially watches all our requests overall. So why switch? Well, it's because Apollo GraphQL happened. After Apollo client hooks, we were able to retrieve loading error data states from the use query hook itself. It gave us ability to make queries on the front end using the hooks way, which is pretty modern way of doing things. And you can also pass in like different variables such as in this case, if it's a cart query and if it's a logged in user or not, based on that, you can pass in like different variables and whatnot. It really made our life easy. And just like use query, we also have use mutation as well, where you can actually trigger any sort of post calls or put calls or anything like that in your front end application as well. So what does this mean? We don't no longer need a cart request. Essentially, we, in terms of a success and failure, we can lean on the hooks itself for the success and failure of the specific request and query. So again, we don't need an action type for all three. And but I'm still not convinced that it does replace Redux, right? Just because what about things like transforming data, normalizing data, handling asynchronous actions, triggering state updates in the component? And remember selectors? For those who don't know what selectors are, is essentially you can access the global state and pick exactly what you're selecting and what state you're selecting as well. So this really helps with testing your data overall, but also you only grab a slice of the state that you necessarily need. So we have Apollo Client 3 that essentially is like, yes, challenge accepted. A lot of good things have come out of the this essentially Apollo Client 3 overall. And that definitely helps a lot with our overall front end state management. Like I'm gonna be honest, I've had my fair share of doubts, and especially coming from a Redux React context background, I felt like this was something that made my life a lot easier and had me convinced this is the great move. So, what essentially is the difference between a Redux architecture and Apollo client architecture? And obviously, there are quite a lot of differences overall, but it's extremely important that, in one case, Redux is going to handle pretty much, or I guess Apollo client is going to handle pretty much everything for us. And Redux is like, we get control to do everything. And that's why it's the meme here. Um, so it totally depends whether you want to give up control or not. But at the same time, I don't want to give up my control, right? Apollo client does do the heavy lifting for you. So, like, it will manage all your state, it will handle data normalization, and a lot of things that we talked about in terms of what makes a really good state management solution. And just because it does the heavy lifting for you, we need to kind of work with it to understand how it internally works as well. Because I feel like this would be like my biggest, I would say, takeaway after upgrading to Apollo Client 3 was that, and essentially using caching as a state management strategy overall on the front end too, that how does essentially the root query works, or how does the overall Apollo client handle the different actions and reducers and all that, all those concepts that we initially talked about. So let us revisit some of the state management principles. My data is not analyzed, right? Because we don't want any duplicates. Just because Apollo takes care of it for us, we don't need to worry about things like actions and reducers. So, what exactly does Apollo Client provide us? It automatically caches your data by generating a unique ID. It normalizes new data in query responses and after a mutation. Just because the cache generates a unique ID for every identifiable object included in the response, the cache stores the object by ID in a flat lookup table, right? And whenever an incoming request comes in with the same ID as an existing object, the fields of those objects are essentially merged. And just because it stores data using references, it can also look up data quite easily, right? And it does all that manipulation for us, right? We don't need to necessarily ask for it to do it because it will do it for you. Whereas in Redux, or I would say a lot of other state management libraries, we would have to kind of tell the state management library to do it for us by actions and reducers and whatnot. So let's take a look of how the root query overall looks like. We need to again, the biggest takeaway being we need to understand how the cache overall works and little bit of how it works internally. So it would keep a copy of it would have like generated a root query. And in this example, back to our card example overall, it would keep a reference for each card object, so that it's essentially going to do a lookup based on reference just to update what has changed in your data. And like I said, understanding the internal workings of the Apollo client would definitely help in terms of how you essentially organize your overall state of your application and so on. Data transformation. This was another principle that we talked about. And even though you think about it, that if we have to manipulate data and we have to transform data, we could also do that in the GraphQL server itself. We don't necessarily need to do that on the front end. But we need to keep in mind that the GraphQL server is not just being used by one team, it could potentially be used by different teams. So, one, we can't just fully transform the data exactly how we like, just because how we want the data to look like is a job of more of a front end application and not necessarily the server. So, again, as it's possible that several apps will be using it, this is something that we need to keep in mind. And let's take a look at a few examples. One is, let's say we are building an e-commerce application, and this is how our cart query looks like. Most of the product details and the cart details are stored essentially in the backend, and this is the GraphQL query that's fetching that data. At the bottom, this is how you would call it in a use query using an Apollo client hook. And on the right hand side, this is essentially the example of data of how it looks like. And again, it doesn't match like exactly, but you can kind of get the idea of how what the product data would essentially look like. So let's say if we do have a example wherein we do want to show, okay, for out of stock or low stock um, card items, we want to show a message to the user. And that's it. This is essentially a React example, right? This is super simple. I have obviously trimmed it down to take the actual logic of the application because obviously that logic would be way too complicated. But on the left hand side, what we are seeing is that we call the cart query and then we have a function to get out of stock or low stock text. And based on what we have in our data, we essentially show, and again, it's super simple. If the card items that we have are is essentially is being subtracted from the available stock, then we essentially say that okay, it's going to be low stock. Or if we do look at the is out of stock variable from the cart query itself, then we're going to show out of stock. And at the bottom, we're just looping. On the right hand side, this is how we would essentially, again, show the data as well as an example. Now, this is how it would look like. But again, all this logic could potentially be used in different pages as well. And we want to make sure that our data transformation is all happening in one spot versus in different spots, right? So how can we achieve the same in Apollo Client? Well, let's do this, right? So what are some local only fields? Now, Apollo client queries can include local only fields that aren't defined in your GraphQL server schema. So, what this means is that you can manipulate a lot of the logic on the front end. The values for these fields are calculated locally using any logic that you want. So, for example, in this case, an Apollo client is making the get card query that we saw. And if you notice something, it's going to go to the server. But at the bottom over there, there is something called a stock text, and it has an at client, I would say, a variable, right? And that's because what it does is essentially using at client. It's not going to go to the server to fetch that information. It's going to go to the client cache on the front end itself to fetch that information. A single query itself can include both local only fields and fields that are fetched from a GraphQL server, like we saw in this example. So how is exactly does the query would look like? And this is how the query would look like, right? We are calling stock text. So in just because local only fields allow us to provide any logic that we want in the stock text, what we have is in the read function, we have the logic for that exact same function that we saw in the couple slides before that. And the reason being that, for example, what's going to happen is the minute we get to this spot, on product itself, it's going to look up stock text. And stock text, it's going to have a read function and it's going to essentially render this logic, right? And this definitely helps. And this is such a cool state management strategy because if you're using any sort of transformers on the front end, you would essentially add local only fields that have access to the GraphQL data. So this is where it would go first. And as you can see, when you're creating the client, that's when you essentially pass it. And now, if you want to access that same data in the component, this is how you would do it, right? The difference being that now all that logic is gone and a component can focus on the UI piece of it and actually rendering the data. And stock text is essentially just being accessed from the use query data variable itself. Now, what about fields that don't need to be defined in a GraphQL type, right? What about them? Well, they also introduced something called as reactive variables. Reactive variables are a specific mechanism for storing local state outside of the cache. Because they are separate from the cache, reactive variables can store any data in any shape that you want. It doesn't need to kind of necessarily abide by the GraphQL server type principles. And most importantly, modifying it triggers an update of the component itself. So again, storing whatever you want, modifies them, triggers an update as well. And this is how essentially a reactive variable would look like. I have created a reactive variable called is logged in var, and you use the make var from Apollo client itself. That would trigger a function called is user logged in. I don't have the logic for this user logged in here. But as you can see, what happens is that function is responsible for checking the token, making sure the token has not expired, and so on and so forth. And we are calling that and storing that in an is logged in variable. And the same thing under type policies, we are defining and returning that. Now, anytime we want to access the is logged in, if the user is logged in or not, and the component should show something, based on the logged in information or not, we essentially could do that just like this. So if the user is logged in, we render the app. If the user is not logged in, we render the login page. And Apollo also gives us the ability to actually access that variable directly in the component using use reactive hook, which is pretty cool. So anytime the user is not logged in because the component expires, the token expires or not, essentially that would render the login page because this component gets re-rendered. Now, isn't that really cool? I mean, I found this super cool. And again, going back to a lot of Redux principles and state management principles, this just solves a lot of the key problems for us. Lastly, debugging with Apollo client. You are also able to visualize your cache as well. And this is extremely important, right? Because as in Redux or a lot of different libraries, we do have dev tools. So you can visualize your cache over here. And this is an example of the dev tools. And based on, for example, is logged in is a reactive variable, and you do need to check off the box for load from cache to show what the value of it. Lastly, testing. We do need to make sure that we are able to test our data consistently. So this is an example of a mock provider wherein we pass in the data, the default mock data as well, if you want it. The key thing here is that we need to make sure that the fetch policy is cache first so that we're able to test the mock request and data. And a component would look like this, wherein we essentially have a fetch policy for cache first. Mock data is essentially data from mocks, and we are waiting and checking if the name is Ankita, for example. I would say that keep an open mind is extremely important just because we are giving up control. But at the same time, just because Apollo Client is doing a lot for us, it definitely helps us in terms of visualizing everything. Again, take control or give your control a little. In Redux, we're already doing a lot. We have bigger problems to solve. Using Redux and Apollo Client with GraphQL, there's a lot of redundant data as well, which is again, we're using GraphQL, but we also have Redux. Apollo Client already stores data. So it does feel quite redundant. And you do need to understand, lastly, how Apollo Client works. It's definitely a mindset shift, but this is something that I feel like with onboarding your team on Apollo Client more, talking about how you want to fetch data, talking about a lot of complex async stuff that needs to be handled maybe by Apollo Client, for example. Things like that would definitely help a lot tremendously with your mindset shift, just because it will help you understand how Apollo Client is doing it for you and how you can work with it to be able to understand it better. Well, this is pretty much the end. If you do have any questions, comments, feedback, catch me after on Twitch. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions after.